my request to our moderator would be that if it finishes by 7:15, so that we can have a quick dinner and the first bus can depart at 8 o'clock. Is that okay with everyone? So I'll just give you some logistics information here. There would be 2 buses, and Ms. Nandini and Mr. Mahi would be responsible for helping you. The buses would be just outside, and if anybody is, so just make the buddy pair, because I am leaving the venue for some work. So I do not want that if someone is lost or missing. So which is why please make the buddy pair. And Ms. Kukreja would be the official from NDMA to support you. Thank you. So we'll start. Very good evening. On behalf of the National Disaster Management Authority, we now commence our last and final substantive event of the 3 days of Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group. This is a side event on building capacities and enhancing cooperation on disaster response, recovery, and rehabilitation. Over the last 3 days, we have heard a lot about response, recovery, and rehabilitation. But in this side event, we have touched upon how to build the capacity in these 3 areas and how to enhance the cooperation. This particular side event has been facilitated by our 2 knowledge partners. One being the National Institute of Disaster Management, NIDM, and ADPC, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. I believe Mr. Aslam is also here. And we have the Executive Director, NIDM, with us. May I now request Executive Director, NIDM, to please take the stage and moderate the session, sir. Thank you.
Good evening to all of you. I think you are all overloaded with knowledge already. And here comes another session from National Institute of Disaster Management. May I invite our distinguished panelists to the dais, please, Mr. Hans Gutman, Executive Director, ADPC, Professor Santosh Kumar, Professor Surya Prakash, and we have Ms. Bongeka Pinke from Republic of South Africa. May I request them to please come on the dais. So I'm Executive Director of National Institute of Disaster Management. Before coming to the subject, let me just introduce my institute and what kind of work we are doing. National Institute of Disaster Management started in 1995 as National Center of Disaster Management, and later on in 2003 it was upgraded as National Institute of Disaster Management in the context of Yokohama Conference in 1994, subsequent to the next year. And in 1995 it was as NCDC after Yokohama Conference, and 2003 it was in the backdrop of the 2 major events in the country that it was made as a national institute, and it was brought in the Ministry of Home Affairs. And 2006 National Institute of Disaster Management was backed by an Act of Parliament and given it mandate to build the capacity, enhance the capacity of various stakeholders, do the research, training, and other policy advocacy and other support to the state governments, as well as the last mile capacity building, including mainstreaming of DRR into various verticals. So that way the India's Disaster Management Act and its institutional framework is very foresighted. Many of the elements of Sendai framework were very much there in the 2005 Act and the mandate which was given to this prestigious national institution. It has forged many alliances, bilateral and multilateral, and conducted many of the initiatives to build the capacity in the South Asian region, in our neighboring countries, as well as with African countries earlier. And the institution is looking forward to further strengthen and look at the new horizons of partnership and knowledge sharing. In this context, today's session, midst of all the gloomy picture of disaster and destruction we all know, and even the midterm review of Sendai framework talks about that, so I'm not going to repeat that. But today's session is a session of hope, that everything is not gloomy. Still, there are islands of hope, there are success stories, and these success stories has a huge implications across the geographies. We can learn lessons from each other. And in that context, today we have got 4 eminent panelists. And first of all, I'll be requesting Mr. Hans Gutmann, Executive Director, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, for his to give an overview of G20 landscape of disaster response, recovery, and rehabilitation, and how it has been building back better, and how ADPC has been, see that hope of collaboration and capacity enhancement, as well as sharing of information and successes as a tool of, better response, recovery, and rehabilitation across the globe. G20 and beyond. I think, let me make this point, that G20 are the economies which are very well placed. But my dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is the developing world. It is the South which is more vulnerable. As you know, that risk is a multiplicative function of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. And it's inversely proportionate to the capacities and capabilities. And as you know, that least developed countries have more vulnerability, more exposure, and less initiative on capacity building. How all of us can today decide and set in this session, which seems to be a last session, but with your proactive support, this can become the first session of a new journey of a cooperation between G20 and the developing world, the global South. Thank you very much. With these opening remarks, I invite my good friend Hans Gutmann to give his views between 7 and 10 minutes.
Distinguished delegates, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, I am acutely aware that I stand between you and dinner, so I will try to be brief. The news headlines is full of disasters, whether it's superstorms, wildfires, resentless droughts, or crushing heat waves, devastating earthquakes, etc. The list goes on. And the news cycle moves on, but the communities that has been affected of these disasters then have an enormous task to rebuilding, rehabilitate, and get their lives and livelihoods in order, and hopefully be able to prepare for the inevitability of perhaps a new disaster. And on many accounts, we see a growing number of disasters globally, the majority of which are driven by hydrometeorological events, climate change. But we should also not forget and bear in mind the destructive power of the deadly geophysical hazards. And we also need to recognize that disasters are exacerbated by population growth, urbanization, and very significantly environmental degradation. Disasters threaten the lives of millions and are taking increasing toll on economic development, which has been extensively discussed in this and previous events. But before we continue, let's be clear on that disasters are not an act of God or inevitable or events which are totally outside of human control. Many hazards occur naturally, but disasters happens when we have people in the way of a hazard and in the path of it, may it be by history, by choice, economic factors, or other reasons. By preparedness and mitigation and resilience, the impact of these disasters can be avoided or minimized. And it is within human capacity to reduce the impacts of disasters, to save lives, and to maintain and rehabilitate livelihoods and protect development gains. This is good because it means that it is within human capacity, there's something we can do about it. With a population of 4.7 plus billion people, the G20 countries have the largest exposure of an asset concentration and vulnerabilities for natural hazards, with a combined annual average loss of close to 220 billion, or 9% of the average annual investment in infrastructure. This in itself presents an opportunity to invest in resilient infrastructure to reduce future losses, freeing up funds for investment for social prosperity. And the figure of close to 220 billion does not even take into account all of the economic knock-on effects, lost productivity, changes in supply chains, changes in market shares, etc. Neither does the figure capture the unequal geographic distribution of the impacts. So recent and ongoing disasters in the G20 countries, the heat waves in Italy, taking lives and having economic impacts, earlier in the year, the earthquake in Turkey, killing many and devastating the infrastructure there, extensive floods here in India, landslides in Brazil, there are just some examples of occurring and recent occurring event. And we expect more in the future, unless risk reduction and preparedness are greatly enhanced. On an institutional level, I mean, G20 members all have systems in place, albeit different setups in different countries, depending on the predominant hazards, on historical and political factors. And without going through all of the different variations, although we have done some analysis on that, some members have practical and functional systems and institutions, but perhaps with limited legal coherence. And others are very clear with the legal mandates. Other factors is the capacity, as was referred to earlier, the capacity of the preparedness and response, as well as the different resilience levels of communities. Some member countries of the G20 have federal systems that needs a response mechanism that is coordinated between the national, state, provincial, state, and the local levels. And this needs a clarity on the different roles and that the different agencies have. Other members have a more centralized system where the response mechanism follow a cascading hierarchical system from national to subnational to local level. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us that this diversity in systems among the G20 means that a one-size-fits-all approach will not suit the G20, and modification, customizations, and adapting tools and approaches are needed. We note with the establishment of the Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group under India's presidency, there is a great opportunity here to promote and encourage collective work by the G20 in disaster response, recovery, and rehabilitation, with the aim of building sustainable resilience. We see the G20 having a pivotal role in the strengthening the international cooperation and enhancing partnerships with international organizations, with platforms, regional bodies, stakeholders, and including the private sector, to mobilize the resources and share the technical expertise and promote mutual learning from recovery and reconstruction experiences. And we note that the Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group highlights the needs to invest and build capacity in key areas of disaster risk management, such in line with the UN call for early warning for all, that disaster resilient infrastructure, financing frameworks for disaster risk reduction, effective building back better, and exploring ecosystem-based and nature-based solutions in disaster risk reduction. Globally, we have many tools, many approaches, and capacities to deal with disasters. But awareness of and capacity to use these existing tools is not well distributed. And this provides an opportunity for the G20 members to promote the use and build capacities to deal with the specific hazards. Over the past 37 years, ADPC, or Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, has been engaged hand in hand with countries and partners and played a key role in Asia and the Pacific region to advance disaster risk reduction through capacity and systems development, facilitating the knowledge sharing and serving as an information clearinghouse of the region, providing technical services. As a technical agency, ADPC supports improvements in multi-hazard early warning systems to promote use of remote sensing and GIS in DRR. And as a capacity building agency, ADPC provides training and learning events at regional, national, and local level. And we're an active promoter of localization of disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management, and advocates for community-based approaches, which was highlighted in an earlier side event. We're also an advocate for gender equality and inclusive approaches in DRR. Our primary focus lies in helping countries, organizations, communities, and including individuals as such, to strengthen their own capacities in all respects to reduce the impacts of disaster. Building strong local ownership through informed and motivated participation in disaster risk endeavors assures a sustained disaster risk reduction and support human development. Another crucial element, which my good friend introduced earlier, is also the need to translate scientific knowledge into cost-effective, environmentally suited practices that are all well understood in the communities concerned. And in other instances, successful activities proceed from the continued appreciation of elements derived from indigenous knowledge, which was also touched upon earlier. ADPC has been engaged with a number of G20 countries in the past, specifically India and China, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa. And we've also, of course, lined up with many of our partners in Europe, Australia, and in North America. We offer, I will change that. We are a vocal advocate for South-South cooperation in the exchange of information, experiences, and professional resources. And we always have been an active contributor to advancing wider international agendas bearing on disaster risk reduction, sustainable development, humanitarian affairs, and climate change. Now, ADPC is partnering with NIDM as established knowledge partners to support the international cooperation and foster partnerships to support the G20 DRR Working Group agenda. And here I would like to emphasize that ADPC and NIDM see South-South cooperation and partnerships as instrumental in increasing the understanding of and investment in disaster risk reduction. NIDM and ADPC understand the importance of comprehensive and extensive capacity building need that is needed alongside the adoption of tools and policies for DRR, and look forward to support the G20 countries in efforts to raise the understanding of and the capacity to act on the priority areas identified by the working group. Bearing in mind that disasters are always local, insofar as the impact is local, felt by the communities affected. Thus, a key challenge in scaling up and scaling out is allow for that diversity to situations and local circumstances and tailor the solutions. A set of case studies will highlight this fact and draw attention to the need to customization of solutions and build an understanding of the local factors and capacities to address these. And there is now an opportunity to reflect on the practices and strategies for building back better pre-disasters, supported by sufficient resources and legislation. And I think we need to recognize that the deliberations at a venue like the G20 meeting provides for an enabling environment. For successful realization of the aims and goals, we need local implementation, and this needs knowledge and capacity. Wrapping up, ADPC recognizes the opportunities in the G20 Disaster Risk Reduction Working Group in accelerating the implementation of key aspects of the global agenda on disaster risk reduction, and recognize the G20 members' capacity to drive positive change. ADPC and NIDM look forward to partner with the G20 members to help realize these ambitious actions set out by the Working Group on Disaster Risk Reduction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hans, for setting the tone of discussion and bringing on table the global scenario, G20's role within and beyond it, and also your technical and capacity building related role that you have played, and ADPC and NIDM coming together, your proposal for sharing our expertise and knowledge. Thank you very much for those remarks. Moving ahead, we have Professor Santosh Kumar, again from National Institute of Disaster Management. And this is something amazing work. You may choose to either speak from here or wherever you are comfortable. So, IUINDRR, that is Indian Universities and Institutions Network for Disaster Risk Reduction was an announcement by the Prime Minister of India, and National Institute of Disaster Management started this project in 2021, and more than 250 universities and institutions have become member of this network so far, and India has more than 1,000 universities and more than 1,000 institutions. So, Professor Santosh Kumar, my question is that how do you see this platform to be a game changer in creation of knowledge and sharing of knowledge, and how it can bring about a quantum jump in both the local to global level? What is its, what do you see its future in the Indian context, and what are the learnings that we can take for the G20 and beyond?
Thank you very much, Chair. Member states who are representatives who are here, and the chair of this working group for Mr. Kamal Kishore, and all the delegates from our institution and from different parts of the world. I'm really grateful to the organizers for giving this opportunity to NIDM, and a very important thing in terms of the question which have been raised, that how this university network would work as a kind of a facilitator of knowledge, and also this cross-breeding of knowledge for the welfare of the people who are at risk. NIDM is originally a capacity building institution of Government of India, and NIDM and DMA, Ministry of Home Affairs, works with the kind of facilitating the process in terms of the providing capacity building services to the administrators of all the states in the country. There is one stream, which is administrative training institutions of the country. There is one stream where NIDM has been extended to almost all the states. The second stream, which was missing earlier, that we were not connected to the university system and institutions, many research institutions, technical institutions, medical institutions that exist in India, but their knowledge directly were not actually routing through NIDM to different stakeholders. So this was the Honorable Prime Minister of India gave this kind of a mandate to NIDM that bring those existing capacity of the university system and also the institution where people are engaged in the research and bringing new knowledge. So there, NIDM took initiative for forming this kind of initiatives and taken this to the scale in just 2 years of time. Many things to come. We are into a kind of a state of building it up. So gradually, so as Mr. Ratnu has said, the chair has said that we have member 250 now as on date, which includes that not only universities, and that not the state universities alone. We have other private universities. We have state-owned universities, and also that federal, state, and national government universities. Plus, institutions of excellence who are engaged in high-end research, like National Remote Sensing Agencies, Indian Institute of Technologies, and Indian Institute of Management. So all are together brought under the one arena. There are many such kind of alliances have been created across the globe. But the idea is to how that benefit of this kind of alliance can go to the other part of the world also, and we can also get the learning from other parts of the world and disseminate it to the larger audience. So that was that one, and there's the biggest kind of a challenge in this, that bringing them together. And in the research work, we wanted to excel for the research, bringing new ideas, new innovations. So that was the basic objective, and enhancing recognition of the vital role of the universities in this process. So that university which were aloof and people were engaged in producing paper and all. So there was this particular forum is giving a kind of a interface between the university and also to their practitioners. So it is a knowledge in terms of those who are creating knowledge, innovating knowledge, that is also going to the field professionals. So there is a connect that at the state level and at the national level, both ways. So there is a connect, and where NIDM also provide this constant capacity support to them, and there also. So this we say as a kind of a transformative one. The second part was, this one is the research. So NIDM started looking for the funding of this PhD programs, and also funding research projects, research projects. This is not a kind of in India, it's not a very organized kind of many departments, ministry they have a program for kind of funding research, but actually at one place where the disaster research organization come together and there we can start funding, and research questions comes from the field and where they wish to do that. So that was one. The second stream was how to transform the future generation, make aware and also transform the situation. So there we started looking into the curriculum. So in India, that the curriculum with the universities we created for the graduate and the postgraduate, and it has now been institutionalized in the whole education, higher education system. So this is a mainstreaming disaster education in the university system. So that is now into place, and then many universities are now started teaching disaster management, and quality control, we are also going for that. The third stream which we want to have a kind of any research which is happening across the country, or that we can start looking those research as a kind of on a kind of a need basis, and the quality of research would also be recognized and incentivized. So these three processes can help. That one is that how we are going from the lab to the land, and this is the connect, and how we can also transport this information and knowledge-based new knowledge to the other member countries. And from their networks, how that we can combine it together so that it can serve it better. And another important point which I would like to mention in this, the whole network process which we started with, the idea of that it's also going to the technical institution and also going to the medical stream. So that the new generation which are coming up in India, which is 28 million people are getting graduated every year, so they would be a kind of a transformative new generation in terms of they will be transformed and not to be informed about the disaster risk reduction in a formal engagement, but they are already coming as a trained, so the trained human resource. So that is the success stories which we can say is that is started working, and many of the state government have started engaging them in the form of providing solutions and getting solutions, giving the research questions and also. So this is the process just began. So I would think if any question would come, that would be better. Just I wanted to inform. But two stream is important. One is that reaching to the practitioners, field practitioners, what are their concerns and how that can be brought to the lab of the research lab, and then how that research back gap giving back to the people who are practitioners. So both academia and the practitioners come together. So this is the kind of we say that as a kind of a transformative, the new generation which is coming up as a kind of a very much informed and educated one. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Santosh Kumar. Thank you. And I think today's session is a testimony that without PowerPoint, you can have powerful points. And these are the amazing case studies coming in front of you. Now, let us move to South Africa. We have Ms. Bongeka Pinke from National Disaster Management Center, Republic of South Africa. In South Africa, I think it's a Department of Cooperatives which has been mandated with the implementation of the disaster management and DRR activities. And we know that by and large, I was just seeing the profile of South Africa, it has been very resilient. I mean, some of the data was showing that from 1900 to 2019, there were reported 2,200 deaths. I do not know how authentic that data was. But we are just seeing that in the recent times, there has been 2021 as well as 2022, there were, both flood situation, drought, as well as you had cyclonic event, landslides also. So in this context, your development, you have tried to use local bodies and cooperative as a vehicle to integrate DRR into development plans. So how has been, what are the success story and the learnings coming out from South Africa which can be of value to other countries, G20 and beyond?
Thank you, Chairperson. Good afternoon. I'm going to touch on the topic that we've been discussing from the first meeting, starting from Amubadat, Mumbai, and today we've been discussing issues of DRR, touching more on planning, integration of DRR. How can we then, as G20 countries, come up with finance mechanisms that can be used for DRR, including eco-based approaches, capacity building, training, the importance of implementing awareness campaigns, community participation, cooperation and collaboration, mainstreaming. We've been discussing the importance of building better through disaster resilient infrastructure, and also public-private partnership, and so many issues. So based on the discussions, we are sort of happy to be part of these discussions because they will inform our policies. We will be able to strengthen the policies that we're having. To touch on your question, Chairperson, in South Africa, we have disaster management legislation that was developed in 2002. We also have the National Disaster Management Framework that was developed in 2005. Both these two pieces of legislation, amongst others, are also guiding the implementation of disaster management in the country. Recently, we have witnessed the increasing incidents caused by climate change, as my colleague presented earlier, with the recent floods that resulted to landslides in KZN. So from there, it is evident that climate change is the driver of disaster risk, not only through the increasing weather-related risk, but sea level, temperature increasing, and also through increases in societal vulnerabilities. So from South Africa, we are driving the process of development of disaster management plans. And since COVID and the incidents that we have mentioned, back in 2013, we were affected by drought severely, almost all the provinces in the country. And we also were affected by floods, especially the areas of KZN, Northwest, Eastern Cape, and Western Cape. Now, what we have done at the national level, we have encouraged our provincial disaster management centers, municipal disaster management centers, as per the requirements of our Act, to develop their disaster management plans. These plans, we are ensuring that they are not only developed, but they are based on risk profiles of each and every province, because our provinces are not the same. Therefore, they are not affected the same. So we then drive the process of guiding municipalities, sector departments on development of these plans and integrating them into the development planning, including spatial planning. Now, amongst others, we are also driving an instrument where we are using DDM, one plans of the district, to also integrate disaster management plans that include disaster risk reduction strategies. And the reason that we are using one plan is to ensure that we are not only developing plans that are not funded. We need to ensure that whatever plan that is developed, including the DRR strategies, are funded. In terms of funding, we are struggling a bit, but we have seen improvement in terms of funding disaster management plans, our contingency plans, our preparedness plans. Each and every sector in South Africa is expected to budget 1.2 of their total equitable shares, and they need to divert that amount to disaster management activities. Similar with the municipalities, there is also a threshold that is allocated for our metros, our district municipalities and our local municipalities to budget for disaster risk management activities, including disaster risk reduction and response. Then in terms of DRR mainstreaming chair, we are also, as required by our act, also approaching sector departments. For instance, we have different sector department that deals with social development, roads, human settlements, and others, agriculture. So we are also guiding them on development of disaster management plans. Previously, we have struggled in assisting them in developing disaster management plans. That's when then at a national level, we decided to develop guidelines to tell them what is supposed to be into the disaster management plan, using, of course, the disaster legislation and our financing legislation to say, if you are developing a plan, it's better to develop the plan yourself using the guideline rather than getting someone else to develop a plan who is not well informed about your environment, the risk that you are experiencing. So we wanted them to develop disaster risk, plans that are risk informed so that they can be able to develop targeted disaster risk reduction strategies that will be able to reduce the risk. Also, in terms of our act, they are required to budget from their equitable shares to say, as a sector, this is the threshold that you divert to fund disaster risk management planning. And also, the issues that were discussed earlier on risk, early warning and early action. Also, we are working with our South African Weather Services and SANSA to also ensure that we forecast weather so that we can be able to issue early warnings on time. And also, they also assist us because when we get those early warnings, they also inform our planning to say which area to be evacuated at a particular time. In terms of ecosystem-based DRR approaches, Chairperson, I'm just going to try to be very fast to save time. There is a department that is responsible for implementing ecosystem-based DRR approaches, which is a Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. So at a national level, we are working closely with the department. There is a project that they are implementing currently where they have identified 14 district municipalities where they will be implementing a project on ecosystem-based DRR approaches to manage climate, intensified disaster risks in vulnerable region of South Africa. So as you may be aware, Chairperson, that we are, in terms of ecosystem-based, we are trying to manage the issues of overgrazing. We have limited land in South Africa, especially in the rural districts and rural municipalities. Then we find ourselves now overgrazing some of the areas, and also the issues of habitat loss and the presence of alien invasive species, especially in the northern part of the country, Northern Cape, that is using or depleting our groundwater sources. So this department is driving that project to rehabilitate and restore those areas. In terms of capacity building and education to our local municipalities, we at the national level helping them in risk identification, hazard mapping, early warning system, working together with our weather services and other partners. Also at a national level, we are also guiding them and supporting them on development of integrated public awareness strategies that is having all the projects, including projects from sectors, municipalities, and national departments, where then they implement those projects in collaboration. Also, the issue of integration of DRM into school curriculum. We have signed a memorandum of agreement with Department of Education to ensure that we drive that agenda, and also collaborating with universities. I think the issue of what do we want to see from this forum, G20. As South Africa, we are, as much as we have progressed recently, but we are struggling with the database of loss and damage, which is a huge problem for our country. We do not have a database of all the damaged infrastructure from previous years, and also yes, we do have a database of the existing infrastructure, but there is also a room for improvement. So it's an issue that we would like to see being looked at within this forum. And as I indicated, that funding is always a problem. As much as we have, as per our act, sort of allocated a threshold for our stakeholders, but they do not prioritize disaster management because they have their own project. And I was happy in the previous sessions that we attended when we then learned of other mechanisms like risk pooling, risk transfer, using of insurance. So it's something that we are going to take home. And the fact that the government of India established a compendium of best practices, especially with regards to disaster resilient infrastructure. So it's something that we will take home. And also we are looking forward to collaborate with countries that have managed to develop these funding mechanisms, and also countries that have sort of trying to mitigate the impacts of drought. We have received a warning in South Africa, sort of a forecasting that we will be experiencing El Nino soon. So it's issues that we need to look at, collaborating with other countries. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much for bringing a perspective from South Africa and many of the new aspects and new learnings that you have brought on the table. Very valuable for all of us. And I think surely India will be happy to share our success story, case studies from India and elsewhere, both what worked, what did not work, and you said about compendium of disaster resilient infrastructure. Surely one of the story of disaster resilient infrastructure we have seen in the Shore Temple, which has been built 1,003 years, 300 years back, and today withstanding the test, and so many cyclones, so many weather events have come, and still it is so resilient. So it is not that we have discovered after Sendai framework the resilient infrastructure in these. We might have conceptualized and given up phrases, but I think we also have to learn from our cultural inheritance that what were the best practices and how those engineering aspects can also be imbibed into our modern education to bring about those practices. So taking forward this discussion, again we are bringing you back to India, and we have here Professor Surya Prakash. Surya Prakash means sunlight. So he is also, shining star in NIDM. I have another shining stars, 3 shining stars there. Please raise your hands. Two of them are my professors. Professor Anil Kumar, a great expert on the environmental matters. We have Professor Chandan Ghosh, who has done his double PhD in seismology, both India and Japan. And we have our joint director, Mr. Thakur, Surendra Thakur. Thank you, entire team is here. I'll coming back to Professor Surya Prakash, who has recently done capturing a case study. A very interesting, why we are bringing this study here is that it is an event which happened between the Mumbai second working group meeting and this working group. a major, extremely severe cyclone that had hit Gujarat coast, and it's a dream of all disaster risk managers that how a hazard can be prevented from turning into a disaster by preventing loss of life. And zero casualty is a dream which we always cherish. And this uh, disaster management event of which which has been documented by Professor Surya Prakash recently, is a story of zero casualty. Literally zero casualty, not even a single life was lost. When the similar intensity of cyclone, which had hit the same area, same region in 1998, and there were thousands of people had died. So what has made that difference? What were the, those points, major 3 to 4 points that you like to focus on, and how this story has learning for beyond India, and what is your take on that, Professor Surya Prakash?
Thank you, sir, for this opportunity. We often say misfortunes enter when window is left open to them, and also state knowledge is power. But knowledge without action cannot bring us the reward of our efforts. So this particular example shows us that what we learned from our past events. One of the examples our EDNIDM cited, Kandla cyclone, which happened in 1998, actually alerted these people, awakened them, and thereafter there was another disaster which struck, not the cyclone but an earthquake on 26th January 2001. Now these two events actually made these communities who were living in these coastal areas well aware that they can be struck by any kind of disaster. So they actually prepared well, and after the earthquake, they were taught that they have to build disaster resistant structures. So most of the buildings which were rebuilt after the earthquake, they were disaster resistant, both from the perspective of the earthquake as well as the cyclones. The second point which I would like to mention here is which brought benefits to us was technology, investments in technology for forecast and early warning systems. Early warning and early action is one of the points being discussed in G20. Government of India in its India Meteorological Department spent a lot of money to invest in technologies for credible and accurate prediction. During the Biparjoy cyclone, when it started genesis from 6th of June 2023, it started monitoring, and it continued till 19th. It has a very long lifespan, perhaps the longest in the Arabian Sea that has ever happened. So the track was changing, but however, the credibility of the multi-model techniques which were utilized actually helped in accurate prediction in terms of landfall point, track route, and time, as well as the duration of the cyclone. So these all actually helped the local administration, district administration, state administration to prepare well, because they held immediate multi-agency coordination meetings. They prepared, evaluated their levels of preparedness, pre-positioned all the resources and the humans, skilled humans, equipped humans, to deal with those threats of the disaster, and also made all protection measures to save all the resources, infrastructure, by putting them in the safe places. So that was the first initiative that was taken up to reduce the casualties. Then the people who were in the vulnerable areas, they were evacuated from those spots, and particularly those who were living in kacha buildings who were likely to get damaged. They were all taken to safe shelters, and in this effort, even the public representative along with the community representatives and administration helped them all. We had already built multi-purpose cyclone shelters. They were taken to them, and many other buildings were actually identified for that. Around 1,47,743 persons, they were evacuated in 2,405 shelters. Another important action which was taken was care of the pregnant and lactating mothers. Around 1,174 pregnant ladies, who are expected to have a delivery within 15 days of this period, they were taken to the hospitals where adequate facilities and arrangements were made. And we had almost 837 deliveries at that time, all safe and secure without any health impacts. So that was achievement. And the children which were taken to the shelters, even they were also engaged, and the babies, cradles were also provided so that they can be better taken. One of the important facilities which were arranged was intra-circle roaming facility. Most often communication gets disrupted and people get panicky. So this facility was provided so that between the different telecom service providers, they can change and the network can continue. So this kind of facility was first time operated, and it was very successful in keeping the connectivity of the people as well as the all concerned stakeholders. Then other failure which you often see is power failures. So for the power failures, all pre-arrangements were made so that power lines should not fail in power supplies. But despite that, there were some expectations for which the DG sets and batteries were provided. Even the telecom services would not have worked without the power supplies. For all these arrangements were made before the landfall of that event. Then water storage, water supplies were another important, which were also ensured, and some tanks were all filled up, and they ensured that people should not fall short of food and water supply when they are in the evacuation centers. Then in this regard, I would also like to make a mention that the NGOs, the local community volunteers, and corporates, they all provided and extended support. And in order to keep people at the shelters safer and without being restrained, they provided the fresh cooked food so that they feel better than what they were getting at their homes. And then industry, there's a big salt pan industry in that region. The industrialists, they took care of their laborers. So all these efforts were made together along with the mercantile maritime board, which looked into the ships and the cargoes which were arriving towards that coast. They diverted them towards Oman. Another issue which happened was there was 50 Singaporeans who were operating at a rig in that particular area. So they all were evacuated by our Indian Coast Guards. So our response forces also acted appropriately and timely in order to save maximum number of lives and achieve our target of zero casualty. After immediately the cyclone was over, the quick restoration works took place, and we could restore all power supply and access communication, transportation within 2 to 3 days after the cyclone. So that was the story of resilience during this cyclone, which we could achieve with all coordination, cooperation, and connectivity amongst all stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Surya Prakash, for bringing this real story of Biparjoy cyclone. I think if some of you remember, we went by flight in Gujarat, Smriti One, the museum which we had seen. How many of you were there in the Gujarat, Gandhinagar, Gujarat, and that? Yeah, it's the same area where the cyclone had fallen, where we have visited. And this area was also one which was affected by Bhuj earthquake. So it is also a story of building back better, how investing into housing and public infrastructure after a disaster, if you do sensibly, it can give a long-run dividends. Therefore, putting money into disaster-resilient infrastructure is not expenditure, it is an investment. It is an investment to save lives and safeguard the future. So a beautiful story which came out from this thing. To summing up this session quickly, I think I do not want to be between you and a long-awaited food that you deserve. But I think our G20 organizers have incentivized beautifully that the first session, and then you get the tourism side. Second session, you attend attentively, then you get the food. So I hope you are able to, we have got the census to capture who is attending attentively and not. Accordingly, the menu is customized. Yeah. So uh, we had, Hens had given a brilliantly overall view of today about, G20's role and global scenario of disaster and bringing that into that investment in capacity enhancement. I think there's a huge gap between how much we are investing into resilient infrastructure and other things. But who is going to handle this resilient infrastructure? Who is going to create this resilient infrastructure? Who is going to maintain through the life cycle of this resilient infrastructure? These are the human capabilities which are needed. And I think if we see the entire pie diagram of expenditure, the actual expenditure on enhancing capacity still needs to be more across countries. And I think that is something which we have to, if we really want a resilient future, we have to continue to provide an enabling environment for knowledge. And that is what the ADPC and NIDM are there as a anchors to, our good case studies of how in this region we have played a role to create more resilience, bring down the casualties, along with other actors and policies. Professor Santosh Kumar has told about how the Indian universities and institutions network has a lot of dividends. On one side, it is a creator of knowledge about innovation. Second thing he talked about was that even the DRR training and learning can be inbuilt into the higher education so that we have a next generation of people who are trained, whether they are engineers, doctors, social scientists, or others who are working in various fields. So it is not, DRR is not a separate discipline. It has to be imbibed into every discipline. So we are working with our higher education departments to have certain courses which are optional for them and the students can opt. And beyond that, youth can become the agents of change, and we can also see that how we can leverage this whole young force to go ahead. And we had a beautiful case study coming from South Africa about how the disaster management framework, which was put into place since 2002, 2005, etc., has paid the dividends, and how the increasing frequency of landslides, floods, and droughts, and how they are trying to imbibe the DRR principles into the developmental plans, and they are guiding the municipalities and local bodies, and how they have been also mandated to have a threshold expenditure for their developmental plans is making the change. And they are also seeing that there is no juxtaposition of developmental plans, but the local bodies themselves are mandated to make their own plans so that they understand their own reality with participation of the communities. And also you have talked about the uh, weather services forecasts, ecosystem-based approaches, invasive species, and your expenditure on capacity building and mainstreaming DRR into your education system, and need for the database. National Institute of Disaster Management also has another mandate to maintain entire country's DRR database. We have information platform which manages each district, each province, each village, what are the resources, human, equipment, etc. are available, and they are periodically updated every 3 months, so that at the time of disaster management, each of administrator who is working in the disaster management field is having access to this data and immediately sources those equipment and data which are available both in public and the private sector. Professor Surya Prakash brought interesting insight on this Biparjoy cyclone and the success story of a zero casualty, how the Build Back Better help earlier, early warning system, community and local administration's role, telecom services of switching. That was a real game changer. I think just I will draw your again attention. This was just something not, it was a great innovation. It was just something out of the box thinking that these service providers try to, give access to their own, signaling and their towers. And therefore, if there was a blocking or jamming of, communication in one service provider, it was switching over to the another one. And this has played a huge role. There were people who required the ambulances. There were people who had to be rushed to hospital. There were the pregnant women who had to be taken to hospital. And the communication power, these become such an important tool to minimize casualties. So thank you, Professor Suri Prakash, for bringing those insights on the table. And as I told you that this is not the last session, I feel this is the first session of a knowledge exchange. And this debate, this discussion, I hope it continues in the next presidency in Brazil and then in South Africa as well. And we are able to steer this. This is a knowledge intangible asset. Knowledge is an intangible asset, and by networking it increases. And nobody can, it is so resilient by nature that it does not, even it's a disaster resilient, because ideas do not vanish. Once you share the ideas, they remain in the system. And therefore, I think we have to have more and more investment on the knowledge creation, on knowledge management, and knowledge sharing and dissemination. Thank you very much. That we come to the close of this very important session. Thank you very much. You deserve a very good food today. Thank you.